Ethnic Media Services Zoom News Conference. I'm Julian Doe, co-director of Ethnic Media Services and your moderator for today's briefing. So how does an individual, a family, an entire community heal from the impact of a hate crime, let alone the relentless rise in hate incidents and hate speech? The question has been front and center for everyone involved in the Stop the Hate movement over the last 2 years. Today's briefing spotlights a new program called HOPE, and it stands for Healing Our People Through Engagement, which is spearheaded by the AAPI Equity Alliance. It operates through culturally centered, community-based groups made up of representatives of the Cambodian, Chinese, Filipino, Korean, and Vietnamese populations. These groups serve as healing spaces for participants to share their experiences and make sense out of the pain and the trauma they have experienced from hate. The HOPE program is adapted from Black liberation psychologists' radical healing framework, which help people of color deal with generations of racial trauma and develop a shared understanding and collective response to ongoing racism. The HOPE program is speakers from the Japanese, Chinese, and Korean community organizations that facilitate the healing spaces will share their perspective on the HOPE program. Our panelists include Michelle Sirwatan Wong, Managing Director of Programs at AAPI Equity Fund; Dr. Ann Saw, Associate Professor of Psychology at DePaul University and past Vice President of Asian American Psychological Association; Seiyu Wang, HOPE Program Facilitator, Social Services Program Assistant at the Little Tokyo Service Center; Yu Wang, HOPE Program Facilitator and Associate Marriage and Family Therapist at Asian Pacific Counseling and Treatment Center; and finally, Joanne Won, HOPE Program Facilitators at Korean Youth Community Center, who holds a BA in Psychology from UCLA. We asked our speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean, and we asked reporters to enter questions in the chat for our speakers. We will hold questions until all of our speakers have presented, and we ask speakers to monitor the chat for questions they can respond to. We will send a recording of today's briefing to all participants, along with collateral and who's who of the speakers after the briefings. And now we begin with Michelle Wong of AAPI Equity Alliance for an overview of the HOPE programs. Ms. Wong, please begin.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you, Sandy, and to Ethnic Media Services for providing us the opportunity to share with you more information about our HOPE, Healing Our People Through Engagement program. My name is Michelle Sarathan Wong, and I am the Managing Director of Programs at AAPI Equity Alliance. AAPI Equity Alliance is a coalition of more than 40 community-based organizations dedicated to improving the lives of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, which in Los Angeles County is every 1 in 6 Angelino. At the height of the pandemic in 2020, the Asian American community endured episodes of brutality on a scale not seen for generations in this country. They were scapegoated by politicians for transmission of COVID-19, targeted for violent physical attacks, made to feel unsafe and unwelcome in their own communities, and bullied and ridiculed by neighbors and strangers alike. As a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, we knew the devastating toll this was taking on our community. Not only were there physical wounds, but we knew from our reporting and data the deep emotional and mental suffering that had occurred. And we wanted to further explore their root causes. This exploration led us to the Radical Healing Framework, a psychological framework developed by a team of BIPOC, Black, Latinx, and Asian American scholars that moves beyond individual level approaches to coping with racial trauma, and instead uses the strength of communities, harnesses their collective experience of both pain and joy to deepen their resilience in the face of hate. The more stories I heard from community members, regardless of age or gender or ethnic identity, the more apparent it became that our community was suffering an epidemic of isolation, anxiety, and depression. The loneliness felt when they were spit on a bus, called a racial slur in a great grocery store, or refused service in a restaurant, and no one intervened. This innovative pilot is grounded in a healing and hope framework that encourages ethnic pride and community empowerment, and reinforces that racism doesn't just occur on an individual level, it happens to communities, to their community, and to other marginalized groups, and that hoping for a different future requires collective action. We have implemented the HOPE program in the 5 largest Asian American communities in LA County: the Filipino, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and Cambodian communities. Although just in the beginning stages of our work, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, providing community members with a space where they can feel safe, supported, and heard. We are presenting these next speakers from the Japanese, Chinese, and Korean communities to share their unique perspective and on-the-ground experiences with you. You will also hear from Dr. Annie Saw, an associate professor of psychology at DePaul University, who, along with her colleagues, Dr. Grace Chen and Dr. Sherry Wang, led in the development of this curriculum. We will also be sharing a short video from the Spread AAPI Love campaign, a project of Stop AAPI Hate to commemorate this last day of AAPI Heritage Month. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our funders at the California Department of Social Services for their generous support of this transformational work, and to acknowledge our community partners at Little Tokyo Service Center, Asian Pacific Counseling and Treatment Centers, Koreatown Youth and Community Center, Search to Involve Filipino Americans, and Pacific Asian Counseling Services, who are leading this work and the implementation in the communities. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. Next, our next speaker is Dr. Ann Saw, Associate Professor of Psychology at DePaul Universities. She's one of the designers of the program, who will explain to us what is radical healing and how does it work and why it's effective in helping people of color in dealing with racial trauma and to heal. Dr. Saw.
Hi, thanks for having me. As Michelle shared, our HOPE program was developed to encourage healing from racism in Asian American communities. Decades and decades of research in psychology and other fields show that racism harms both health and mental health. It can lead to symptoms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And it can cause people to experience feelings of misunderstanding, isolation, and disempowerment. As an Asian American researcher and advocate, the need for healing became increasingly urgent and apparent when I, as part of the Asian American Psychological Association, was working with AAPI Equity Alliance, Stop AAPI Hate, and other community partners across the US to document the negative impacts of the pandemic and the associated rise of anti-Asian hate in our Asian American communities. Many were experiencing symptoms of racial trauma, such as depression and anxiety symptoms, physical symptoms like headaches and trouble sleeping, hypervigilance, and withdrawal from the people around them. With AAPI Equity Alliance, I shared a vision for helping our communities come together to heal in ways that centered our communities' histories, their cultures, and the local contexts in which they live, and that are grounded in cutting-edge theory and research. We know that Asian Americans tend to underutilize Western-based mental health services for many reasons, including stigma around mental health and accessing mental health services, and also lack of available culturally and linguistically appropriate care. Knowing that organizations all across our country are trying to meet the needs of Asian Americans, to meet them where they are with mental health support, and we know that they are seen as trusted resources. So the HOPE program bridges these key assets of our communities, providing a healing space for community members where they can feel comfortable, supported, and affirmed in their experiences. We're so excited to share about this program because, to our knowledge, it is the first community-based program developed from the Psychology of Radical Healing framework. And it's one of the very first community-based programs to address the mental health impacts of racism for Asian Americans. As Michelle mentioned, and as Julian introduced, the Psychology of Radical Healing framework serves as the foundation for our HOPE program. It was developed by a multiracial team of psychologists of color, and it was published in 2020 in the journal, The Counseling Psychologist. And the framework itself builds on decades of theorizing and research by Black, Latinx, and other researchers of color. One of our collaborators on this project who contributed to the development, as Michelle referenced, Dr. Grace Chen, was part of the team who developed this radical healing framework. So what is the framework? Well, it is very innovative and very new, even within the field of psychology. And it emphasizes healing rather than simply coping with the traumatic impacts of racism on communities of color. Radical healing is about becoming whole in the face of ongoing racism through connecting with others in our communities, drawing strengths from our community, our culture, our families, and engaging in individual and community actions that promote our collective as well as our individual well-being, resilience, and encourages positive change. Many people ask, what makes radical healing radical? We draw from the work of Angela Davis, who reminds us that the roots of radical, the term radical, the basis of that word radical, is about getting to the roots. In this case, getting to the roots of the injustices that harm us. And I'll talk a little bit about how our program utilizes some of these, the tenets of this framework to address the impacts of racism for Asian Americans. Although Asian American communities have a heightened awareness of racism since the start of the pandemic, they rarely have a chance to talk about these experiences with others. Many in our communities, in particular newer immigrants, may not have a language or a broader historical context to understand their individual experiences with racism. So we aimed to create a supportive space that encouraged honest connections around the pains of racism. These spaces are not easy, but they are necessary to promote healing, and they can help address the feelings of loneliness and invisibility that many Asian Americans feel because of racism. By helping people see how their experiences of racism are connected to their communities, our Asian American communities' histories of injustice. For example, laws that have discriminated against groups of Asian Americans. And also by encouraging our participants to brainstorm about how communities can come together to do something about racism. Hope participants can begin to feel less alone and more empowered. You'll hear next from 3 of our very best facilitators in our Hope program. And hopefully from what they share, you'll see how Asian Americans healed through the opportunities our program created for connection, for support, for empowerment, and for learning. Thanks so much.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Saw, in explaining the framework and how does this program actually work. Sharing personal story is something that people in Asian culture don't normally do due to community shame and stigma. But this program is actually encouraging people to do just that. And we first go to Seiyu from the Little Tokyo Service program to talk about her facilitation and the people who participate in her programs. Please, Seiyu.
Hello. Thank you so much, everybody, for having me here. I'm excited to share about my experience facilitating the HOPE program through Little Tokyo Service Center. I think that at the beginning or the onset of this project, there were some doubts that were floated about whether or not this program was needed in the Japanese and Japanese American community. However, once we actually launched the program, we gathered our participants and we started to talk to them. We could see that this program was actually very much needed in the community. And I'll give some examples as to why. The participants talked a lot about these microaggressions that would build up during the pandemic. For example, the fact that they stood out for being Asian American and wearing a mask, so that simultaneous being Japanese or Japanese American and wearing a mask in public made them feel like they stood out or were targets for attack. Another thing that folks mentioned is that when they were in a crowd, for example, and they saw another Asian American person, they would feel this need or desire to protect the other person, even if they weren't actually going to, do something mentally. They still felt the stress of wanting to protect the other Asian American person who was in the crowd. So these may seem like very small or minor things, but actually it's very much in keeping kind of with Asian American culture that we dismiss the smaller things because we don't think it's important. So that became kind of a theme as we were going through the program, is we're validating, we're affirming the participants, we're saying these small things, don't push them aside because they do matter. And the small things, they build up and become bigger things. And that's why mental health becomes poor over time, because you don't address the small things, right? And so that showed us that this program was really very much needed in this community. And going through the program was very interesting because Japanese Americans are unique in that they have very different generational experiences. So, you know, we had new Japanese immigrants in the group. We also had Japanese Americans who were fourth or fifth generation. So different generational statuses across participants was something that was very unique and interesting to this community. And one thing that, you know, we found is that a big concern for new Japanese immigrants was the loss of culture, or potential loss of culture, loss of ways of life, and then the way that this connected with, you know, Japanese Americans who have been here for more generations, right, is that they actually fear the loss of the history. Because, you know, one of our participants was talking about the internment camps and how her grandparents actually survived the internment camps. And she fears the loss of that history because the history is not being told or passed on. So it was very interesting to see participants meet each other where they were and hold each other, hold space for each other. So, you know, newer Japanese immigrants fearing the loss of culture, and then Japanese Americans who have been here for longer fearing the loss of history, and the ways that this kind of melded together when participants were talking about their concerns within the community. And I think the most empowering part of the program is that we had a call to action towards the end of the program. And I think this really empowered our participants. We asked them to talk about an issue that they see in Little Tokyo today. And the participants actually came together and realized that gentrification is a big issue that they wanted to talk about. But gentrification also encompasses the loss of culture, the loss of history. So a lot of the fears that they had expressed previously was also being expressed through gentrification. So the fact that they were able to get together and talk about gentrification, and then to talk about solutions to gentrification and things that they can do to challenge that in their community, was very, they walked away feeling very empowered. And so the only other thing that I wanted to add was that a lot of our participants were very young. They were in their 20s. And seeing like a role model from their community, which we talked about Yuri Kochiyama. So even though she was from a different generation and she was from a different time period, right? They still felt empowered by her. And even though they felt that there was no, at first, a lot of them felt like there was no direct correlation between Yuri Kochiyama and their lives. But after they talked about mobilizing to fight against gentrification, they started to see more connections between themselves and Yuri Kochiyama. And I thought that was really interesting. And so I will stop there, but thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Seiyu. Now we go to Ms. Yu Wang, also another facilitator of the whole program among Chinese participants at the Asian Pacific Counseling and Treatment Center Ms. Wang, please go ahead.
Thank you all for having me here to share my thoughts and experience leading this group. So given the significant trauma and discrimination our community faced during pandemic, from being yelled at on the street or feeling unsafe leaving their home after seeing news of Asian hate, I think a space for healing is critical needed. It's also difficult because our culture traditionally doesn't emphasize sharing feelings and vulnerabilities. It made it difficult to talk about experiences related to racism. Also, many of us lack the language to express our negative emotions, which exacerbate the feeling of isolation and fear. So in our group, actually we had 4 participants of diverse backgrounds in the Chinese or Chinese American community. Actually, the small group size made the space more genuine and intimate as the participants shared their feelings of helplessness and fear. Among the 4 participants were a male who has lived and worked in the US for many years, and 2 international students who have recently entered the workforce, and a female at her 40s who grew up in a predominantly white community in California. So the male participants who felt unsafe around other Asian and excluded by other cultures initially expressed distrust and hopelessness when talking about our community. She said, I don't feel I'm Chinese and I don't believe in Asians or Chinese. However, after seeing how others share their stories openly, she felt encouraged and shared her own story. So also by participating in different activities, including the community brainstorming activity Shu just talked about, our participant, the female participant, ultimately felt accepted and hopeful. She said it was the first time she felt truly accepted by a group, and she wanted to explore her Chinese identity and culture further. I think because our community tends to internalize traumatic experiences rather than talking about them, this healing space was so powerful and allowed us to express and validate these feelings. One international student in our group shared, before this group, they didn't see the community as a resource, but now they do. I think this group also gave us the opportunity to learn how to support each other and enact positive change in our community. For example, our male participant who had experienced racism at work initially wanted to quickly fix others' problems, and he often dismissed other participants' feelings. However, after a few sessions, he started to learn to listen and reflect on others' responses and understood that racism can occur on cultural and structural levels. I think this growth of the participant actually showed the importance of understanding each other and working together for larger change. This experience of leading this group also made the concept of radical healing more tangible to me. I realized that contributing to our community doesn't have to be overwhelming. It can happen at different levels. Leading this group of 4 participants from different walks of life not only empower me, but I think also help me envision how to better support my clients who have experienced racism. I think also by participating in this group, those 4 are already making a difference in their lives and their surrounding community as they continue to heal with the tools of radical healing and hope. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Yu Wang. We have a number of questions in the chat direct to the panelists, Dr. Saw, Seiyu, and also Yu Wang. If you can take the time check the chat, and then you can answer your questions directly there. So we go to our last panelist, Joanne Won. She's a Hope facilitator for the Korean Youth Community Centers. Please begin, Ms. Won.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's so nice to be here to be able to talk about the HOPE program. I am a co-facilitator for the Koreatown Youth and Community Center. And to give you a little bit of details on what our meetings look like. So our curriculum took place across 6 weeks. Each meeting is 2 hours each, and we held 1 meeting per week across 6 weeks. And we had 5 participants, and they all identified as either Korean or Korean American. And it was the same 5 participants for every session. I think part of the reason why HOPE is such a great program is because, you know, speaking from someone who is Gen Z, racism has always been something that I kind of understood on a theoretical level. But as an Asian, as a Korean growing up in California and Koreatown, I've really had the privilege of always feeling represented. And I've personally not faced any significant racism that was either explicit or aggressive in any way. But that quickly changed during the pandemic. You know, I think the anti-Asian hate crimes that were taking place during the pandemic really caught us off guard. At least it did for me, because there was the main focus of worrying about our physical health by this invisible threat, right? COVID. But it quickly changed to this very present physical threat that, you know, that my parents were worried about, to the point where they were afraid of stepping out of their homes. Just going to the grocery store, because we kept hearing about all these crimes that were happening in New York as well as Koreatown. But, you know, I was able to feel how fearful they were. And therefore, it made my experience during the pandemic that much more anxious and fearful. And I think the whole program is just great because not only am I able to understand, you know, racism through my own experiences, but by having these meetings with these 5 other Korean and Korean Americans from diverse backgrounds and unique experiences, we're able to feel a sense of connectedness by really sharing our stories. And I could feel the way that these participants were able to feel connected with each other as well. One story that really comes to mind is a participant when she was sharing, so she is a first-generation immigrant. She had a very emotional and cathartic moment of sharing her experiences with racism. And as part of the HOPE program, participants are able to freely share stories involving any racist experiences they've had without any interruption or problem solving from other participants and facilitators. And as she was sharing her story, she revealed an incredible amount of pain that, you know, she was expressing for the first time. You know, tears were shed, and she was explaining a microaggression that she faced, and it kind of became this listing of all these different types of microaggressions that she had faced up until the point that she came to our meetings. And some of them include being outcasted within her neighborhood, being made fun of for her cultural differences, or comments from others that really conveyed how much they looked down on her just because of her accent, and how all of that in totality really affected her mental health. And as we kind of held this space for the first time, me and the other participants, it was amazing to be able to allow and also like feel the full range of emotions involving racism. And although there was essentially silence from the facilitators as well as the other participants, as the participant was sharing her story, we were maintaining this space of non-judgment and acceptance in a way that still felt very supportive. And this feeling of connectedness that the participants felt just from that, as well as across the 6 weeks, I could tell that the participants were getting really friendly and caring more about each other with each consecutive meeting. And you got to remember that these 5 Korean or Korean Americans, they were essentially strangers when they first started this program. But by the end of the 6 meetings, the participants wanted to stay in contact with each other. And even we all went out to eat lunch after the final meeting. And it was just this amazing community that we built of just a shared sense of acceptance and understanding that we're no longer isolated in our pains involving racism. And that's why it's so important to, it's essentially a step towards the healing process, that radical healing process. And this whole experience just made me really think about how wonderful like this program would be for my own parents, right? My parents are first generation immigrants, Korean immigrants themselves, and they're in their late 60s and my parents are in their 60s and 70s. So I was thinking that we're essentially providing these participants with the tools and understanding and connection to really heal from any trauma relating to racism. And I thought, how wonderful would it be for my parents to have a space like this as well and experience the joys of being in a space like this as well, like the other participants. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Joanne. Now we are going to open up for questions from the audience, but I'd like to start first with the questions for Dr. Saw. So, Dr. Saw, this community healing program and story selling is not a substitute for individual therapy or counseling, right?
Right. It is not a substitute, and we would encourage anybody who's struggling with their mental health to seek support from professional therapists if that is consistent with what they feel they need. You might think of our HOPE program as an alternative for those who feel like they wouldn't be helped by a therapist, or as sort of a something that they would use in conjunction with other mental health supports. What we offer is very different. Many of our facilitators are not trained mental health facilitators, and we wouldn't say that we directly address and help people cope with their mental health symptoms if they have any. But we think that through this process, through what our program does, people are benefiting indirectly. Their mental health is indirectly improving because of this program.
Julian, you're on mute.
Well, after all this, I still forget I have to unmute myself. But thank you, Dr. Saw, for that. And Seiyuu, there's a very important questions from Henrietta Burrow, one of our media partners, is that during your presentations, you talk about that there is an urge to protect other Asian people. And this is something that is very important. There's training for bystanders participation. So can you elaborate more on that? Where did this urge come from?
Yeah, I think for this particular participant, maybe the urge seemed to have come from the fact that they had been seeing so much anti-Asian hate crimes and violence in the news. So it kind of created this sense of unsafety, of general unsafety. So much so that when they saw another Asian American person in public, there was an impulse, even though they didn't act on it, there was this impulse to say, oh, I need to look out for this person because somebody could do something to them, right? So.
Great, thank you. And then to Ms. Yu Wang, you spoke about sharing story itself is actually can be a challenge because there's this lack of language to express emotions in the Asian cultures. So could you talk a little bit more about that? Why is it so challenging, and how do you overcome that? And then for participants in the program whose English is not first language, so do you have a separate sessions for the in-language speakers for that way they can participate more fully?
Yeah, I can answer the last question first. So I think for this particular round of our workshop, we actually facilitated in English. So that's why we kind of did a screening before the workshop to make sure like they can at least be fluent in English to express themselves. But I think Dr. Ansel also mentioned in the chat box for next round, we are going to do it in Chinese and in their native language. And I think I think because as we're growing up, like it's kind of our culture not to talk about vulnerabilities, right? Like it's kind of shame talking about that. And also I think many of our members from our communities, they in their families, their parents don't talk about emotions or vulnerabilities. So it's hard for the children to learn how to talk about their emotions. And also I think like one participant, he tried to kind of fix the problems when talk about like experience related to racism. I think it's also like a way for him to kind of protect himself from showing vulnerabilities, because he's like, oh, I can actually fix the problem, or there's like something I can do to cope with the problem. But I think the whole structure of the program was helpful for them to kind of connect their experience to their feelings. So there was we kind of encourage the participants to share in turns, and then the participants share their experience, their emotions, and then the next participants will first reflect on the previous participants who shared, and then start talking about their stories. I think in this way, we kind of are trying to practice. We're teaching the participants how to reflect on others' emotions or experiences instead of fixing their problem. I think that actually helped. And also, I think giving their we also give them like some tools like emotion wheels. So there are a lot of emotions, and at the end of the workshop, we kind of let them to identify their emotions. All these tools, I think it helped them to learn how to kind of talk about emotions.
Great, thank you. And I have one question for Joanne. Is that your group it's a good mix of demographics background, right? And so are you noticing there hesitations between these groups to share, because you have the older and then the younger? Are the older tend to be more reserved and the younger tend to be more open? If you can share some of that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I hadn't really noticed any of that from our group. Obviously, during the first two meetings, I think there's this shared sense of awkwardness just because everyone's a stranger, but our participants for KYCC, their age ranges were from their 20s to 50s. So we had about two people who were in their 20s, I believe two people in their 40s, and then one person in their 50s. And I think what really set us up for success in terms of removing that factor of this reservedness or this hesitancy to share, very vulnerable experiences and emotions regarding racism, without the whole like age dynamic coming into play, was by setting community guidelines at the beginning of our first meeting. So community guidelines were basically rules that we all decide together to create a very safe, respectful, and a very just a very safe and respectful space for people to be able to be vulnerable without feeling like, oh, like, I'm too old to be saying this, or you're too young to be saying things like that, right? So we all have this shared understanding that everyone has unique experiences. Just because we're all Korean or we all identify as Korean doesn't mean we all have the same experiences when it comes to racism or even our immigrant journey or our family migration history, which is something that we talked about. But we all held space for our unique stories and our unique emotions. And yeah, I think the community guidelines really set us up for success to remove that sense of age dynamic or sense of reservedness.
Great, thank you. Now we go to audience questions, and in the interest of time, I'm going to identify the person and also the questions. And the first one is from Kai Curry. It's been answered in the chat, but I'd like to hear from Dr. Saul. And with an added expansion to the question is that what are the plans to expand this pilot program to different city or states? And I'd like to add that would this model apply to other ethnic groups as well? Dr. Saul?
Yeah, I think Michelle answered it a little bit in the chat. We have this dream of having this program be available to any Asian Americans who want and need it. At the same time, we're in a pilot phase of the program and still learning what works, how we can best train facilitators to make sure that the program is effective. So we hope that in the future we can offer it. We're just gathering more information to figure out how to make that happen. And of course, would need funding to help support that. So we do hope to be able to do that. And to your second question about application or use for other ethnic groups, we have tailored the program based on the conceptualization and research of others, specifically for Asian Americans, because every group's experiences of race and racism are so distinct. Even within our individual communities, as Cheo and Joanne and you shared, there's tremendous variability. So the tailoring has been primarily with these 5 groups that we introduced. We think that it could work with other Asian ethnic communities. I would say that we would not want to just take off the shelf this program and use it with another racialized community, that would require further tailoring. But when we're thinking broadly about how this program is meant to encourage people to feel empowered and maybe take action to fight against racism, that requires racial solidarity. We need to work across different communities of color for that to happen and to happen effectively. So it would be interesting to think and brainstorm and maybe work to figure out whether some sort of cross-racial group could happen. It's just not quite our HOPE program, but it could be HOPE 3.0 or 4.0.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Saw. So I would say that Asians in general tend to be reserved and can be said that maybe even passive. So how do you get these people to share their stories and also from the individual program, are there any difference between Japanese American, Korean Americans, or Chinese American when it comes to sharing story that seems so personal and also seems a taboo? So I'd like to ask this question to any of the panelists. Sei-Yu, would you like to take us to answer this?
Yeah, I can start us off. Thank you for the question. I think one thing that really helped within our community for Japanese and Japanese Americans is that there was a lot of what they called pair share built into the program. So that was when, we did our program over Zoom, so we didn't meet in person. But we were able to put people into breakout rooms, which were smaller groups of it was like basically just groups of 2 or 3 people. So I think that really helped people open up. And I can say that confidently for a fact because sometimes we had an odd number of participants. So I would be, as a facilitator, I would be paired up with a participant. And I can see them open up in a smaller group in a way that might have been hard for them to open up to a larger group, right? It's a lot scarier to say something to 7, 8, or 9 people than it is to just share it with one person who's intently and actively listening to you and giving you affirmation. So I think that was one way that we were able to tease out a lot of these stories. Thank you.
So in other words, you might not start with a big group, but you can start with a smaller group and then gradually build up.
Yes, I would say that that's accurate. That is one strategy that we used. Yeah.
Okay.
Julie,
Yes.
can I add on something to that question? One of the first activities that we started with across all of the groups was an activity that asked the participants to reflect on a favorite food from their culture. And it was amazing to see how many participants really opened up and loved this activity because it got them to connect to their culture and to experiences from their upbringing that really cemented their relationships and this sense of safety. And because we did that very early on and we created that sense of respect amongst participants, I think it really allowed them to then talk about more difficult or challenging things in conversations. And of course, the facilitators were really trained to hold the space and to ensure that everyone was respectful of each other. So I think the way that Dr. Annie Saw and her colleagues really developed the curriculum was really instrumental in getting participants to open up and to share about potentially traumatic experiences.
Okay, thank you for that additional input. So I'd like to ask Ms. Yu Wang. A lot of the community healing, especially in California, has been focuses on the group that just been through this traumatic tragedy, which is the Monterey Park. So are there anyone in your group talk about how this trauma has affected them and how you see at the end of the session, you see there's a difference when they were able to share their stories?
I think some of our participants did mention like how this just seeing the news on TV can make them feel unsafe. And also, I think when they're talking about these events in the our workshop, at first they sound really hopelessness, and they're thinking, oh, actually we cannot change. Like we are always like kind of passive. We cannot voice for ourselves. But then I think because of the structure of the workshop, when they kind of connect to each other, and we also introduce the racism on different level, not just interpersonal. It happens on cultural, structural, and then we give them a chance to brainstorm how we can make the change for our community. I think even though at first it looked kind of intimidating for them to do that, but they just kind of participate in the activity like naturally near the end of the workshop. And then they said like after the brainstorming, they said it's very exhausting to think about this, but actually it's really empowering to look how we can make the change step by step. And I think it also gives them the hope for the community to make changes and to also help them heal from the hopelessness.
Thank you. Dr. Saw, I hope I'm not jumping too far ahead, but it seems like being able to share some of these most deeper fear and anxiety people have in terms of trying to see how they can heal, how they can move on. This seems like almost like a life-changing kind of a process, event that might be an outcome. Dr. Saw?
I hope so. I think for many of the participants who have shared with us, with their facilitators, with our evaluators, it does seem like people were really, really moved and impacted positively by the program. I think what we are doing is so radical, a different type of, different definition of radical, right? So different from what is offered in our Asian American communities, but just at large, that people have a space to talk about the things that have hurt them the most, that maybe this is their first time ever sharing these experiences with others. And I think, because we're creating these spaces that are so different than what people are used to, they have really expressed an appreciation and a lot of gratitude, but also shared with us that this has been really impactful for them. We have seen people in one of our groups start a podcast to have a space to share out with others about what it's like to be Asian American. We've, as Joanne mentioned, created friendships of support. So I think that it has, for many people, really positively impacted them, hopefully in the long term, that they're going to continue to face racism, but hopefully now they have supports and tools and ideas for how they can deal with the racism that they experience. And we have people who say, I'm going to share this with other people. I'm going to share what I've learned with other people. So we're seeing these ripple effects.
We're now coming to a time of closing. I would like to ask each panelist to share with the audience about what will be the call for actions. If I can ask Joanne to go first, what will be your call to action?
Yeah, I think one call to action from this is, getting this curriculum out to as many other Asian American or Asian communities besides the ones that we've already covered here. I think that would be the best first step.
Great, thank you. How about you, Wayne?
Yeah, I think also kind of similar to Joanne, like let more people know. I think just the concept of radical healing can be empowering. Talking about this with people I know and also my co-workers to help others heal from their trauma.
Okay, thank you. Say you.
Yeah, I think that the call to action is really for the community to reflect on their own assets. What I learned from this is that our community has a lot of strengths to offer. And if we reflect on what we already have, it's a good thing to build from there. Thank you.
And Dr. Saw, this healing is not even a group healing. This is a community centers on healing, right, Dr. Saw?
Absolutely. Can I add my call to action?
Yes, please.
It would be for policymakers and funders to support organizations like KYCC, APCTC, and LTSC, and the others, and so many others across the country who are doing really innovative work like this that our communities are really resonating with.
Thank you. And Michelle Wong, you get the last words.
Thank you, Jillian. My call to action would be for all of the other organizations and media and journalists to really promote the need for this type of healing in our communities and the importance of this intervention tool so that we can get more funding to bring this to other communities who we know are in need. Thank you.
Thank you. And the reason we didn't pull out too many questions from the audience, which were Mary, because all the panelists have answered all the questions so well in the chat already, but I'm glad we get through all the major points. So now our briefing is officially adjourned. Thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend.